Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Okay, now if you look at the slide, we are talking about positive duties. Okay, now a crucial difference that Pogge makes over here is that, well, most of us, and if we would recollect from the last article that we talked about, in which Singer also made this notion of supererogatory acts, that acts of charity or acts of assistance from the affluent is a matter of praise. It should be praised because it is an act of charity or supererogatory acts, acts which are not required. Now, Pogge too fine tunes this distinction, commonly held belief or moral belief that, well, it is an act of charity that, well, when an affluent nation contributes to a lesser affluent or a underdeveloped nation. But Pogge tries to shows that the existing world poverty manifests a violation of our negative duties. So, our duty is not to harm. So, what he is basically saying is that, well, positive duties are duties that you ought to do, and there is nothing wrong if you do not do it, but negative duties is our commitment not to create harm, which is therefore more minimal and therefore much stronger, as more foundational, that after the completion of negative duties, positive duties may be reward worthy or praiseworthy, but negative duties are almost seen as a necessity or as compulsorily to be performed. So, removing world poverty does not belong to this notion of positive duties, but to the very fundamental nature of negative fundamental nature of negative duties, that is, our duty is not to harm. So, Pogge does not talk about positive duties tackled here, he does not tackle it in this paper. In fact, he does not find alleviating world poverty as something which belongs to the domain of positive duty, rather it belongs to our duties not to harm. So, it is not that when the affluent are assisting the poor that it is an act of charity to be praised, but that it is something that has to be necessarily done by the affluent. And let us go into the genealogy why he holds such a view. Well, to first he regards the negative duty stronger than the positive duty. So, gives an example that the duty in the third bullet, the duty not to assault people is more stringent than the duty to prevent such assaults by others, and having assaulted another, the attacker has more reason to ensure that his victim's injuries are treated than a bystander would. So, Pogge makes a very binary stance here, that, well, analogically. So, when he says that the duty not to assault people is more stringent than the duty to prevent such assaults by others, and having assaulted another, the attacker has more reason to ensure that his victim's injuries are treated than a bystander would. So, first, that poverty is not the affluent are not a bystander to the whole game of poverty coming into existence, that the affluent, as he shows, are directly responsible for the poverty that comes to different nations, and he tries to prove that, and therefore, having caused this poverty, the affluent owe duties of reparation to the underprivileged, because it is direct it is a harm done by the world's rich onto the world's poor, and therefore, the world's rich are required to compensate for this harm that has been done. And so, before we go into that Pogge's claim, what is this? Let us tackle a little bit about this notion of negative duty being stronger than positive duty. So, how do you associate that? But would you like to dispute that, or as negative duty as stronger than positive duty?
His argument appeals to me. You know, the example that he gives, in which he says that if you are a bystander, then you do have a duty to prevent an assault on somebody by a third person, but if you're someone directly engaged in that assault, then the moral responsibility is greater. So I think, well, before I go into this, I would like to disagree with you on the understanding of positive duties itself. It seems to me that you understand positive duty completely as supererogatory acts, as acts of charity. But I think they are to be understood properly as duties, moral obligations. And even in Singer, when he says that we can't maintain the distinction between duties and supererogatory acts, what he's really saying is that so-called supererogatory acts are also to be considered acts of duty. So he expands the realm of positive duties, but he only tackles with positive duties, acts that one is morally obligated to perform. And I think that, so he doesn't go, so for him, on a superficial reading of his article, it seems that for him the affluent citizens of the world are mere bystanders in the world event of poverty. He doesn't go at all into the roots of poverty and the role that the affluent play in causing and maintaining that poverty. But Pogge's approach is completely different, and he shows how the affluent are not just bystanders but active agents and participants in that event. So that being the case, the affluents being directly involved in bringing about that harm and in maintaining it, they have, so if we talk about their duties concerning that event or that situation, it can no longer be seen as a simple positive duty. It has to be understood as a negative duty, not to harm, because they are involved in causing that harm in the first place. And it also has to be understood as an intermediate duty to prevent future harm from some action that they have performed in the past. So I think Pogge's analysis of the situation is it's deeper than Singer's.
Okay, he goes a step ahead and finds this because when he says that, well, negative duty is making this concept that, well, that is something that has to be done if you have to have a moral existence. Yeah.
And if you don't analyze the role of the affluent in world poverty, then you cannot go, what basis do you offer for their moral duty to interfere in that situation and to alleviate it? You cannot go beyond saying that on the basis of a shared humanity they have to.
The pull of such a claim is not as strong as the pull of when he understands it or when he understands it in terms of a negative duty. So
yes.
Just as I am not obliged to, perhaps so strongly, to help a bystander, but I am definitely more required not to harm a bystander. So so when tackling global poverty, Pogge pulls down this tackling of global poverty from a positive duty to a negative duty. That is, it is a requirement not to create harm, and global poverty is a result of a failure of this negative duty. So even in our inaction, what many of us would like to think as our inaction or our choosing not to be more human than we are, Pogge's downright claim is that, well, tackling global poverty comes under the duties of reparation. It is a wrong that has already been done and it has to be undone or compensated. So that way it is an attack, just as the analogy he presents, that it is a negative duty because the attack has you have attacked a bystander and thereby you are more obliged than anybody else to compensate.
And also you continue to attack them through
right.
the socio-political institutions that you help maintain.
In fact, yes, he puts out the world economic order as that way. So, well, negative duty does come out stronger than positive duty. Positive duty does what Singer does is he tries to fuse supererogatory acts into duties, that they are no more praiseworthy, that they are essential duties. Perhaps Pogge is a layer stricter, and he further reduces it to that these acts are not only a part of what one they should not be praiseworthy, but they are expected to be done. It goes one step further and says that these acts are acts of reparation. So, these are necessary. So, these are like the repayment of a loan, they are no more an act of charity that needs to be praised. So, duties of reparation are much stronger than charity. So, here whatever assistance or whatever means for alleviation of global poverty is talked about, they are duties of reparation, and they are definitely much stronger than charity and definitely not an option. So, how the wealthy, now of course this stands on the question that, well, how the wealthy are morally related to poverty. This is not a case for charity, but for negative duty, as Pogge puts it. But what makes, now Pogge goes on to explain that why it is a part of negative duty, that how the wealthy are responsible for the poverty that comes across. And this is when he claims that the wealthy are responsible for sustaining the macro order that benefits and perpetuates from inequality. So, this is almost a contestable, this is the most contestable claim that Pogge puts out, that, well, many of the world organizations would count on humanity as the pull for assistance, whereas Pogge puts it out that, well, the wealthy are responsible for sustaining the macro order that benefits and perpetuates from inequality. So, here inequality is not a random event, but it is a very, very caused event, and the cause of which is the cornering of the resources of the world to the affluent, and thereby at the cost of at the cost to the poor. So, this is where many macro order theories would differ from Pogge. This is a very crucial claim on which Pogge's entire argument hinges upon. One of the claims that I can see immediately is that, well, the theory that first, wealth is not the worldview that wealth is not a finite amount in the world, and wealth can be generated. It is not that to make one person or to make a region wealthy, it has to be at the cost of another region. Now, so an argument could be that, well, wealth is definitely not created by cornering it out of another region. Another strain of argument could be that the wealthy are wealthy because of their thrift, because of their effort, because of their efficiency, and the poor are poor because of the lack of these qualities exhibited. Now, there have been very strong critiques of Pogge's claim over here, that which to them has made a very black and white interpretation that all wealth is cornered out from poorer regions to wealthier regions, and there is no factor given to human effort and human thrift and the human element in creation of wealth, where and wealth is simply seen as a transfer of resources from one part to the other. You would have some views on this.
We have discussed this while discussing Singer. Right now, what comes to my mind is that a human enterprise is important, but human enterprise needs a conducive environment to thrive in, and that is where the macro order comes into the picture. One can reasonably ask if an enterprising person would have the same amount of success in a developing country as she would in a developed country. The odds that she has to battle against in a developing country would be so much higher.
Right, okay, this is taking on Pogge's strain that, well, even if human enterprise has to be valued, it has to be valued only if we have a common fertile ground for it to prosper, and this macro order does not allow for that even a parity between these common grounds where human enterprise has to can prosper, and therefore this macro order becomes so essential and so overpowering that it dominates over the presence or absence of human enterprise. It makes it almost futile. Okay, now we talk about the ecumenical approach that Pogge takes again to bring forth this very claim that he talks about. Yes,
You know, but one does also think about those individuals in the developed country who have risen up the economic ladder by dint of their own hard work and enterprising spirit. And if you go to, I mean, their case is very different from the case of the big CEOs and business tycoons. If you go to them, a person who has started out as a factory worker and then gone on to, make a very successful career. If you talk to such a person and say that your success is not a result of your own efforts, but of the socio-economic institutions in your country that benefit its own citizens at the cost of citizens elsewhere, I don't know how convincing that argument would sound to that person. But it may also be a case of that person conveniently not taking that bigger picture into account and selectively deciding to focus on their own efforts.
right. And perhaps at the first encounter with such a question, this person would feel wronged that his entire effort is being reduced to just a fertile macro system around him, but or her. But perhaps if I may be allowed to rephrase that question, and if you ask that person that would she be able to achieve the same level of that she has achieved in a different macroeconomic or macro social order, and that would perhaps bring out the role that apparently inert socio-economic or the macro system around an agent plays in the flourishing of that individual. So yes, it's almost a statistical correlate that most of the best students come out from most of the best schools, and it is only a thin segment of outliers where there is an exception that worse off schools bringing out better off students. It's a simple.
In the latter case, the students are successful not because of
that is an
atmosphere, but despite it.
That is an enormous tribute to the power of human spirit that overcomes all odds against it. But not counting the outliers in making a policy, that it's almost like a deterministic setup that people or students who go to such a kind of a school will probably land up in such a kind of a profession, whereas people who go to such a kind of a school, another kind of a school, have more probabilities of landing up in another kind of a profession. Of course, human endeavor or enterprise is not written off, but it only flourishes in an environment, and it requires enormous energy to flourish in an unsuitable environment. And it's also not the case that a suitable environment will bring out the best in everybody. But yes, so Pogge's attack is that discounting the differences in human enterprise and potential, and perhaps at a deeper level even seeing the differences in human enterprise and entrepreneurship as a result of the macro structure in which one is raised, where vent is given for ideas to translate into reality, and where there is very little vent and possibility for the ideas to translate into reality. That itself affects the the human enterprise or entrepreneurship. So in a way, yes, Pogge's essential claim is putting the macroeconomic or macro social, the macro structure before the individual enterprise, and thereof that becomes more fundamental than human enterprise. So when he talks about, now this is another, as a paper in applied ethics, there are certain it stands on certain foundations and stilts about theoretical ethics that it talks about, and one of this is what he calls the ecumenical approach. So traditionally we have been aware of theories and theories contradicting them and another theory coming up. So an author's loyalty remains to a particular theory, and there is an argument against another theory by propagating maybe a counter theory to it. But here Pogge brings about almost like a populistic or a universal appeal, a universal net cutting across all ideological commitments. So he wards off the possibility of reading an ideology into his claim, and he makes it he pegs his theory on a single consistent baseline of he does not peg his theory on a single consistent theory. In fact, it is he makes an appeal which can be seen across various theories. So it is not particularly that he is arguing against the consequentialist theory or in favor of deontological theory, but it is almost an theory that has a universal appeal cutting across theoretical or ideological commitments. So he puts it, he explains it in this third section of his article when he talks about radical inequality. He puts out 5 basic observations which are very empirical in nature, and but hardly there would be disagreement about these observations. The cause of these observations may vary, or the justifications of these observations may vary, but these observations are fairly generic and empirical and fairly well documented. Well, first is that the worse off are very badly in absolute terms. They are also very badly off in relative terms, very much worse off than many others. So it is not that in just in absolute terms that they are doing ill off, that the requirements of human existence are lesser than what are absolutely required, but he also points out that they are also badly off in the terms of the disparity between the worse off and the better off, and this inequality is impervious. So that the movement from one segment to other segment is not as free flowing as it ought to be. This inequality is pervasive, it pervades a large region, and last of all his claim, which is definitely not an empirical claim, that this inequality is avoidable. So his understanding of radical inequality pegs on these almost 4 observations and a 5th value claim, claiming that this inequality is avoidable, because if these 4 observations are true, what it means is that there is enough resource to be distributed amongst all. So in principle it is possible to have a lesser disparity and a higher absolute minimum standard, and to allow mobility between segments. So if these 4 observations are accurate, then it is obvious that, or it is logically very obvious that inequality is therefore avoidable.
Why do
Yes.
you say he has a single consistent baseline?
Well, because
He says he doesn't.
he doesn't, yes. He is reacting to a single consistent baseline, so that there is no, in fact that way he is anti-reductionist, that is his theory cannot be reduced to one particular theory of ethics. So in fact his approach therefore is more ecumenical, because it is more Catholic or more encompassing human requirements and sensibilities than flowing from a ideological commitment to a particular kind of theory, and therefore he tackles various theories at various levels. Now he talks about engaging, in the 4th part of his article he talks about engaging historical conceptions of social justice. And now this brings about the genealogy, that how he thinks that, well, social justice is not a matter of is not an option, but is almost a necessity because of historical wrongdoings. The social positions of the worse off and the better off have emerged from a single historical process that was pervaded by massive grievous wrongs. So, now this is the beginning of a worldview of which this article's claim is a applied conclusion to it. So, the view being that, well, the social starting positions, that how people start off, both the worse off and the better off, have emerged from a single historical process that was pervaded by massive grievous wrongs. So, the poor and the rich did not evolve out of different processes at different places, and therefore they are not independent or innocent bystanders to each other's position. Rather, they are the product of the same process, and therefore there is a very close connect between the worse off and the better off, because they have evolved or emerged from a single historical process that was, and this historical process is pervaded by massive and grievous wrongs. The most obvious example from the Indian tradition could be the colonial legacy, that, well, the colonization of a nation has completely stripped the resources of a nation into a more prosperous nation, and this moral accountability has to be extended over generations. Now, these are two very foundational claims that Pogge here is making. One is that they belong to a single historical process. He is seeing the entire world order as a single historical process, of which the wealthy and the worse off and the better off, the wealthy and the poor, are mere offshoots. Therefore, one is connected to the other, because the other way of looking at the other worldview at the same position would be that different cultures which developed independently of each other have had their own enterprise flourishing into bringing about affluence, or the lack of it bringing about penury. But Pogge makes it very clear, his claim being that it's a single historical process that was of which the poor and the rich are offshoots. And secondly, that this moral accountability, that this poor and rich or the wealthy and poor were a process of were offshoots of a single historical process, and therefore their succeeding generations owe moral accountability to the same. Now, this is a very crucial claim, because how does one extend moral agency over individuals? In fact, this is the claim of moral agency being extended over generations. That from various if this is held as an guiding principle, then having moral accountability over generations would almost naively put or simplistically put read about punishing the coming generation or rewarding the succeeding generations for the acts of preceding generations. Now, this seems to be two very dominant views, worldviews that, or foundational views that Pogge hinges his claim upon, but which are nevertheless quite debatable and disputable. So, this the author reads this historical context as so strong and horrendous that there ought to be an ecumenical agreement on just entitlement. The rich have to have a Catholic holistic agreement for the affluence that has been cornered into their parts of the world as sourced from which are now the poorer parts of the world, and there just has to be an agreement on just entitlement. So, what about before we proceed, let's just explore this notion of moral accountability over generations. Now, if this is a guiding principle at one hand for making do or undoing the exploitation or the cornering of resources that had taken place taken place by one generation, then it also opens up.
One hears objection being voiced against this claim, this tenet of morality, in the Indian context as well, in relation to the reservation policy. individuals, some of the individuals belonging to the so-called upper caste, argue that since they themselves were not responsible in creating the unjust caste order and the resultant deprivations, why should they have to suffer in order to rectify the wrongs? One thing that comes to my mind in response to that objection is that we have to recognize that the inequality or the regime of deprivation and discrimination is far from over. We haven't left it behind in the past. Be it the caste system in India or the pervasive poverty and inequality in the world, or the colonial and imperialist regime which creates that inequality. It's not over, it's not a thing of the past. Imperialism continues to shape the world. So, but it may have reinvented it, it may present itself in new avatars. So, the first thing is to recognize that the source or the system of deprivation continues in some form. The second thing I think, the second thing to recognize is that even if we are not personally involved in holding up that system, we are its beneficiaries in some way. So, well, reverting to the Indian situation again, if I'm a so-called upper caste person, but I personally believe in equality of all human beings and I don't engage in any discriminatory act against anyone. Even then, just because I was born in this upper caste situation, I have reaped some benefits of that situation. I have been treated differently in society. I've had a differential sort of access to resources, not just material resources, but also cultural resources, which ultimately put me in a better situation in life. So, and you know that the advantage that all those factors have given me are not a result of my own individual effort. So I can't say it's all earned by merit, personal individual merit. If I recognize that, then I'll also recognize my duty to compensate for the corresponding disadvantage that other people have suffered due to similar factors. Did I complete my sentence?
Yes. In fact, perhaps Pogge couldn't agree more, because this is the same kind of a justification that he proposes, that well, if one is responsible or one is benefiting from the results of an unequal distribution that took place in preceding generations, so one ought also to be responsible for the duties of reparation that stuck along with the unequal distribution that started in the preceding generations. So yes, moral accountability over generations only if, and even very well put in the Indian scenario, that positive or affirmative action finds its justification, that because this generation may not be discriminating as the earlier generations, but this generation does benefit from the advantage that the earlier generations got out of the discrimination, and therefore when this advantage is inherited, the responsibilities for the just entitlement, as Pogge puts it, also are inherited. So for Pogge, this moral accountability over generations finds its justification in this kind of a claim, that if we do benefit from inequality, how much ever in the preceding generations that took place, we also therefore inherit the advantage and therefore the responsibility for a just entitlement or the duties of reparation that we have. So next, Pogge's claims that argues against the fictional notion of history that claims that any distribution, however skewed, could have been the outcome of a sequence of voluntary bets or gambles. Now yes, here he is alluding to those people who would like to critique the historical processes as various or several processes where cultures or generations in cultures took decisions or showed lack of thrift and therefore landed up in the poverty that they landed up in, or the other way around, landed up in the affluence that they landed up in. So such a fictional notion of history that claims that any distribution however skewed could have been the outcome of a sequence of voluntary bets or gambles, just as the way even today, perhaps giving an analogy to this situation is that, well, the wealth or the lack of it that a person lands up in is a result totally of his or her own good, wrong or right choices. Now this also perhaps Pogge would not agree, because this also depends on the kind of macro order that these two individuals have been exposed to. So just as it is very much possible that, well, children in the Indian scenario from the underprivileged background are highly likely to be schooled till a lower level and thereof highly likely to take up employment at a semi-skilled level, whereas children of the privileged classes are highly likely to be exposed to better schooling and thereof highly likely to land up in more skilled employment and therefore more affluent lifestyles. So these seem to be this seems to indicate a problem in the macro system, not just a result of the individual decision making. So maybe 3/4 of the people languishing in Indian prisons come out from the lowest income groups. So Pogge's very systematic claim is that this 3/4 is not because these 3/4 of these people of the people in the prisons are belong to the underprivileged classes or lower income groups because they all took wrong decisions. It is because the macro order is such that almost determines them to take decisions which they would have not taken. So putting it totally on voluntary, putting one's position or taking full or assigning full responsibility for one's position in socio-economic order to one's own decisions, irrespective of the macro milieu in which one is raised, seems to be untenable according to Pogge. So in fact he goes on to appreciate Locke when he does his historical extrapolation, because we theoreticians want to extrapolate to understand why the way things are. The first and the most obvious way is to extrapolate. So he finds well with Locke's extrapolation. He says that, well, a fictional extrapolation of history can be plausible only if the participants rationally agreed to the contract. So he puts it forth where he talks about the social contract theory, and he talks about, well, the justification for the contract theory is that, well, when all the participants rationally agreed to the contract. So if we take a process of colonization, so Pogge would say that, well, this is colonization or the colonial spread can be seen as a conscious process which resulted in this unequal distribution of resources only if all the participants rationally agreed to the contract. So any extrapolation has to give that much of credibility to the agents that in principle they would have rationally agreed, and that filters out a lot of historical claims that seem to justify inequality as a result of individual decisions. The present world is characterized not merely by radical inequality as defined, but also by the fact that the better off enjoys significant advantages in the use of a single natural resource base, from whose benefits the worse off are largely and without compensation excluded. So it's a very powerful claim made that, well, the present world is characterized not merely by radical inequality as defined, but the fact that the better offs enjoy significant advantages in the use of a single natural resource base, from whose benefits the worse off are largely and without compensation excluded. So in fact this goes ahead, in fact I could surmise that we even question property rights right from what the claim Pogge is making over here. Say for instance, let us take something like a single natural resource like potable water. Now in a same transposing this claim of Pogge into say an Indian scenario, we can find that well, in the same city there is better quality water in the bathtubs and the flush tanks of people, and for the same quality of water people have to wait for a very long time and have a very difficult access to the same level of water. So Pogge unequivocally puts it up that well, this significant advantage that the better off enjoy is not any coming from any parallel natural resource, but it is the single same natural resource from whose benefits the worse off are largely and without compensation excluded. So something like potable water. Now there is a single natural resource, and if it can water the lawns or land up in the bathtubs, it is landing up at a cost, and the cost is borne by the worse off who are prevented from accessing that water, and there is no compensation for the same. In fact, this is almost a clarion call against the commercialization of the distribution of natural resources. So any natural resources that a society is endowed with, to commercialize it and therefore distributing it according to one's commercial ability or requirement against one who is not commercially capable enough to acquire it, is more than radical inequality. It is even the radical inequality model that Pogge suggests is only mere in comparison to that. So especially when it comes to natural resources, Pogge is pointing out that well, the significant advantages that the better off enjoy are at the cost of preventing or at the cost of the worse offs, who are therefore prevented and without compensation excluded. So in fact, one can draw a lot of applied cases that occur or that have occurred even in the Indian scenario. One that occurs to me is the pisciculture or the shrimp business that took place in India a few decades back, which was largely outsourced from the West to India and adjoining Asian countries, because it did consume a lot of water from the water table, and this water from the water table comes at a cost to the access of water from the water table to the farmers in the adjoining areas where these pisciculture units started up. So a natural resource is clearly finite, even if some theoreticians would like to propose that wealth can be generated or can be created. In the matters of natural resource, there can be no such argument or ambiguity. That natural resource is definitely a finite resource, and that comes from any allocation of it will definitely or any distribution will definitely affect both the parties amongst, or all the parties amongst which it is distributed. This distribution of natural resources is definitely not innocent, and the better off are responsible for deprivation of the same natural resource to the worse off. If he goes on to say that if current inequality is justified as a consequence of the historical root, it falls short, as the actual historical processes is populated with huge wrongdoings. Pogge's claim is very clear here that well, the historical there can be no justification of inequality from the historical root. So one does have to get into the history of the world order to understand the different positions taken up. So, and he does find huge wrongdoings in this historical process. So as it is, the citizens and governments of the affluent states are violating this negative duty when we, where he means citizens of the wealthy or affluent nations, in collaboration with the ruling elites, cliques of many poor countries coercively exclude the global poor from a proportional resource share and any equivalent substitute. So, here this is the final accusation that Pogge makes, is that citizens and governments of the affluent states and the ruling elites of many poor countries together sustain such a macro system which corners away a disproportional resource to a certain population and leaves very little resource or for the others who are condemned to poverty thereby, and not also providing an equivalent substitute. Now, this is a problem, or this is a claim that he is raised, is faced in many societies, in many cultures, about in various perspectives. So, we can have places like the building of, in the Indian scenario, there are the buildings of dams, of roads, of access to water by industry, and where commercial interests clearly come in conflict with fair distribution. So, Pogge's very foundational claim is that, well, the macro order is such that the distribution of financial power does not reflect, in fact far from is just, it is downright unjust. The ideally an economic system or a financial system would want affluence to be a representation of human thrift, ability, enterprise, and the lack of it a reflection of that. But Pogge finds fault with that this distribution in financial power is not caused by that particular generation, rather it is or by that particular individuals, but it is only a result of the macro order in which people are, and therefore deciding on the basis of financial ability or commercial ability, or using that as an indicator to, or a parameter to distribute natural resources is definitely unfair. So, historical process, one has to look into the historical process, and the historical process is flooded with wrongdoings, and these wrongdoings needs to be repaired. We cannot start at a zero baseline. We do have to take a look at the what made the baseline different for different people, and therefore we do have to have a correction in the baseline. So, this is what he talks about when he talks about engaging with the historical process.